Catholic Film Club Horror Movies Intro, take 1. Welcome to the Catholic Film Club. My name is Michael Coy, and I'm joined by Patrick Bautista. And we're going to be talking later in the program with Dr. Nathan Bowman, who is the chair of our theater department at Benedictine College. Well, actually, I will, because you were under the weather, Patrick.
That's true. Yes.
But since we're talking about horror films, I wondered, what are your 4 favorite horror films? Go.
Oh, gosh.
We're doing a letterboxed thing.
4 favorite horror films.
Clock's ticking.
Yeah. I got to list the ones that I have seen. So I really liked Get Out.
Cool.
I thought it was a cool analysis of...
Let's analyze later. Go.
Okay. I haven't seen The Shining, but can I say that it's my my top 4?
No.
Okay, Prisoners, number 2. Not really a horror film, but I'm making it a horror film because it's really terrifying, but it's also awesome and weirdly beautiful. Number 3, horror films.
Ghosts.
Gosh, ghosts.
Stabbers, people that stab.
Halloween. I've seen Halloween.
Okay.
And I've seen Scream.
So these are the 4 horror films that you've seen. It's not your favorite.
No.
And those are your favorites?
Yep. Those are my favorites.
Okay, I guess ipso facto, those are your favorites. Yep. What did you think about... What?
How about you?
How about me?
Yes.
Okay. I think right now my 4 favorite horror films are I Walked with a Zombie from the 50s, I believe. This low budget, really cool movie from the director of Cat People, Patrick.
Oh. I have not seen Cat People.
Or heard of it?
No.
It's really good. This was this guy, Jacques Tourneur, was like this really cool low budget director, and he made this really cool movie called I Walked with a Zombie. Short, sweet, to the point. I think it's all for free on YouTube right now. Okay. Anyway, also coming out on Criterion. You shouldn't be allowing me to vamp like this.
4 favorites.
Four favorites. So that's 1. The Innocents, which is a adaptation of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Really cool ghost story. Other horror films. I should have prepped this ahead of time. I'm doing for the audio listeners. I'm looking at. I'm accessing my temples and the brain between them. Let's see. Horror films. I have to say the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That is a really amazingly put together horror film that has incredible editing and composition on a shoestring budget, and actually has very little on-screen violence compared to the remakes that just went stupid violent and just ruined the whole thing. It's just completely terrifying. And number four, I'm doing I want to say Blue Velvet, but that's not a horror film. It takes place firmly in the real world, but that's so disturbing. Give me a challenge here, a category. I'll just say The Tingler. Isn't that a funny word?
Is that a movie?
That's a Vincent Price movie that scared the living daylights out of me as a kid. It's about it's the weirdest movie in the world where he's a scientist who's accessed he's found there's this thing on your spine that makes you afraid, that triggers your scream impulse, and he takes this thing out of someone's spine and it becomes a little creature that crawls along. And there's a scene in a movie theater where a lady looks down at her leg and sees the Tingler on it and just freaks out and screams, and everyone starts screaming in the theater. And as a kid, I was just that is the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life.
That sounds pretty terrifying.
And then I revisited it later, and it's actually so cool and bananas and really, really fun. I got a Blu-ray of it recently, and I can't wait to rewatch it this Halloween.
I have to borrow that.
You should. Yeah. You should. Those are my 4 favorites at the moment. Pretty eclectic group, hopefully.
Nice.
Although 4 of them are in black and white, so how eclectic could that be? Yeah, but upcoming in the conversation, we're going to be talking, as I said, to Dr. Nathan Bowman, and he's got some really interesting reads on horror and Greek tragedy. So, are you excited, Patrick?
I'm very excited to not be in it.
Yeah, I know. But you'll be there in spirit. Welcome to the Catholic Film Club. My name is Michael Coy, and I'm joined by Dr. Nathan Bowman, who is the chair of our theater department at Benedictine College. Nathan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about horror films today, and it's perfect time. It's kind of around Halloween, and I just wonder, what is your fascination with horror?
I've always just loved horror films. Before it became a sort of research topic of mine, it was just something I had always been really into. I did not have the most observant parents growing up, and so I was watching just the bloodiest, goriest, R-rated horror films from an inappropriate young age in my life, but I don't know what kind of scars those left, but basically I've been watching
Sounds
horror.
familiar.
Yeah, but I've been watching horror films for a really long time, and I've always just been drawn to them. It's like there's always a good horror film for something. And it seems like even when we talk about like, is horror becoming a less popular genre? Like there are always things that people are afraid of, and horror always gets at that. And it's always just fascinated me.
Yeah, it's such a vast and malleable genre. I mean, later in this episode, we're going to be kind of listing out a few of our favorite horror films. And in thinking about this topic, there are so many of different varieties. You could go bloody disgusting in the way that you were exposed to early, but you could also go in the more classical route as well. So, but I understand that you wrote was it your thesis on a horror film specifically? Can you explain what that was?
Yeah, so when I was doing my PhD, my dissertation was on kind of the relationship between horror and Greek tragedy. So Greek tragedies, from a theater background, is kind of my area of focus, but I'd always been drawn to horror. So when I was in grad school, I was kind of thinking like, how do I like make these things work together? And I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And then I was kind of observing and researching some of my favorite productions of Greek tragedy and what they do that I found effective. And one of the things I noticed is that there's a really strong supernatural component to Greek tragedy, and the productions I was always drawn to are the ones that really emphasize that component. And so my dissertation was about how the horror genre and like the aesthetics of horror can be used as a way to understand how to produce Greek tragedy for modern audiences. And sort of thinking about the overlap and relationship between the two of those.
And what did you find?
Well, I think aesthetically they're quite similar. I think generally speaking, I think the thing that connects horror and tragedy is this idea of human confrontation with suffering. And like, a lot of horror films, not all of them, but a lot of them do emphasize the sort of suffering of the human body, which Greek tragedy certainly does. That's usually a center point of Greek tragedy, is this idea that due to punishment from the gods or a mistake that the main character made, some sort of physical suffering occurs. And I think something that ties both horror and tragedy together is this idea that you have human characters who, through their own devices or not, are thrust into these sort of impossible circumstances, and they're forced to figure out what to do within those circumstances. And so to that end, I think both are very human. It's that sort of central like existential question when you're given like two impossible choices. You can't not choose. You have to do something, even though you know the outcome is probably going to lead to suffering either way. And I think horror and tragedy both get at that quite a bit.
One of the things I love about horror is, or I also find so useful as a storytelling genre, is that it makes manifest the psychological, but also makes manifest these traumatic incidences in our lives, and gives us a way of looking at these sort of titanic personal conflicts that you're talking about in another way, so that we can maybe confront them more easily, or at a distance. Do you see what I'm talking about there? Yeah, it's like,
Yeah, because like on a day-to-day sort of, in the way that we live, we sort of ignore a very central component of life, which is that there is violence in life, and violence and suffering are a part of the human condition. And on a day-to-day basis, we tend to want to ignore that and not talk about it. And horror, as you said, there's an aesthetic distance between the film and the audience, but it is a sort of medium by which it allows us to engage with that in a way that we don't in our regular lives. And I think there is kind of a healthy component to that we should be, as Catholics, I mean, we engage with suffering a little bit once a week, right? I mean, suffering is central to the Passion. But outside of that, we don't tend to want to discuss the reality of it. And I think horror maybe opens a window for us to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I like what you say about us engaging with suffering. I mean, we're engaging with the sacrifice every week, some people every day, if they're lucky enough. And this podcast will be released in October, and so we're looking forward to All Saints Day, but also to All Hallows Eve, which is was originally and still is a Catholic holiday where we remember the dead, and the Catholics, we as Catholics have. I think one thing I like about living in this Catholic faith is that sort of confrontation with death, and an understanding that mortality is right around the corner. And horror engages with that in a similar way, although it capitalizes on fear more than hope, let's say.
Right.
Do you have an example of a horror film that does provide hope at the end? Because I think a lot of people might not want to engage with the genre because it's kind of puts the audience through the ringer, so to speak, and kind of like it asks you to engage with pretty tough and obviously scary subject matter.
Yeah, a horror film that engages with hope. I think maybe not hope per se, but one that I'm kind of thinking about is Frankenstein. Because it doesn't necessarily engage with hope per se, but it definitely frames the events that occur as a sort of like corrective, which is that the main central character, Dr. Frankenstein, oversteps the bounds of what humans are meant to be able to do. And then his creation, the monster, is not really evil. Like, it's a living thing that wants life and wants love and wants to be treated like a human with dignity. And the doctor rejects the monster and says no. And so then the violence, the streak of violence that the monster partakes in terms of revenge, for the revenge of it all, I think it's similar to Greek tragedy. It's meant as a corrective to human hubris, right? So I'm not necessarily sure that that's hope per se, but I do think there's hope in this idea that like hubris and human pride ultimately will be paid for, if that makes sense. I think there's hope in the idea that hubris is corrected on some level.
Yeah. What an amazing idea that Mary Shelley happened upon 200 years ago. We're still remaking Frankenstein so much today, like with Ex Machina, for example, which isn't a horror film, but it is the Frankenstein story all over again. Well, your expertise, I would just say your thesis was all about Greek tragedy. What was a central film that you engaged with, where you found that sort of synthesis between horror and Greek tragedy?
Yeah, Hereditary.
Hereditary.
Yeah.
One of the most disturbing films I've seen. I almost walked out.
Really?
Because there's a point in that film where a horrifying event happens, and I didn't know if I trusted the filmmakers to take me through and just do something other than just shove my face into misery.
Yeah.
I was glad that I stayed, but man, talk about something that puts you through the ringer.
That movie does not let up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does not let up. But because of that, I actually found quite a few similarities between that and tragedy because, in Greek tragedy, there's no like subtext or hidden meanings. I mean, it's just, for the most part, characters say exactly what they're thinking, meaning at any given time. And most of the time that's some form of like lament or suffering. So, I mean, it's an hour and a half of characters lamenting about their suffering, right? So it very much just, in a similar way, does not let up. It was interesting. I was working on my dissertation and I was trying to just find this sort of piece that made all the things connect. And I'd never seen Hereditary before. So I watched it. And there's this scene in the movie in which the main character, her name is Anna, I think, the main character's son, who's in high school, Peter, he's in a class and he's zoning out or something in the class. I feel like that's a trope in like every horror film where there's like a teenager in a high school classroom zoning out or something.
Yeah, you see it in Halloween, you see it in It Follows, and just sort of, and then they look out the window and they wish that they hadn't.
Exactly. But anyway, so in this scene, the teacher is giving a lecture on a play by Sophocles. I don't think it specifically says what the play is, but they mention the character Heracles, so it's probably one of, the Heracles plays that Sophocles wrote. And the teacher is asking all these questions about the play, and the question the teacher poses to his students in the movie is, did this happen, or if this happened to Heracles because he made one bad mistake, but what about the fact that this was preordained as a sort of fate from the beginning? So what control, whatever the choices he made, what control did Heracles have over his fate at all? Mm-hmm. And that's a central question in a lot of Greek tragedy, the relationship between our choices and the sort of will of the gods. But what it did is it framed what happens in that movie around this idea that's in Greek tragedy of how much control do we have over what happens to us in our life through our choices. And that is kind of one of the themes of the movie, I think. But then that just like made it click for me. I'm like, oh, this scene in Hereditary very explicitly shows the relationship between what we see in this movie and Greek tragedy. And ultimately, I think that question is grounded in this idea of existentialism, being confronted with impossible choices and being forced to choose. You see it in like Abraham, for instance, kill your son or disobey God, right? I mean, that's like that for Kierkegaard, the existentialist philosopher, that was like that great leap of faith, that philosophical question when you're, presented with these impossible choices, what do you do? And I think Hereditary got at that really well and explicitly tied it to Greek tragedy, which kind of made that all click for me.
Yeah. I think because I want to follow up on this, so I'll just put like a spoiler warning for this part of the discussion, but at the end of Hereditary, I wonder how you interpret the main character's choices at the end, and if he even made a choice, because it's revealed that he seems to be in the mind of a sort of coven of witches, I suppose, a reincarnation of their demonic spirit, which they worship.
Right.
And is that the case or isn't that the case is up for grabs. But I wondered, and also I should say, it's not clear to me what the filmmaker Ari Aster, what his perspective is on that. Is that a triumphant thing or is it a horrifying thing? And it's not up for a film to answer all those questions, but I'm curious what your interpretation of that was.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, one, I agree that I think he purposely leaves it open. Mm-hmm. But my interpretation of it is that none of these characters ever had a choice throughout the entire film. And we see them struggling to gain agency and make choices throughout the film, but ultimately they're being manipulated by this supernatural force, and ultimately when if it's between the humans and the supernatural, in horror often it's the supernatural that wins. And I think that's what we see in Hereditary. And I think that, that's kind of the, I guess, tragedy of that film, is that no matter how hard they are trying to choose otherwise, they're ultimately led to this fate, which how are we supposed to feel about that?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Yeah.
I don't really know.
Yeah.
Ari Aster's output in horror, at least, has been incredibly interesting. And another film that he put out was Midsummer, which I'm not sure if that... Would you interpret that as a continuation of what he was doing in Hereditary? Because I kind of see different, more agency on its main character. But what was your interpretation of that film, Midsummer, which is about a group of young people who go on a trip to the Netherlands or to Sweden on a sort of midsummer holiday event in a unnamed town in the Alps, maybe. And then quickly turns out that they are at the center of a pagan cult ceremony where sacrifices will be made, and many of them human sacrifices. Gosh, we're getting really into the the most horrifying of horror, but it's the most it's one of the most impactful horror films of the past decade. So I just wondered what your interpretation was of that film.
I mean, I think you can definitely see similar threads between Hereditary and Midsummer. I mean, they both center like a sort of pagan cult. And yeah, the main character perhaps has more agency in that film than any of the characters in Hereditary. I think most of the characters in that film are still very much manipulated by this cult to do, what the cult wants them to do is to be sacrificed, I suppose. And so I still think there's that sense in which they're all being manipulated to some degree. But I do think whether or not, I mean, spoiler alert, just so you know, the central character basically joins them and becomes one of them toward the end of the movie. And yeah, I think it's definitely, one could interpret it as she's choosing to do that. I'm not so sure if it's that clear cut, though.
She is under the influence of a lot of drugs that she's been given by this cult. I guess what I see, and it's really leads to a larger question of how has the relationship in horror to paganism changed throughout the century? Because I think you could draw clear lines where there are moments when things like this are seen as like objectively bad, where I sometimes get the sense, and it could be that Ari Aster and directors like David Eggers are leaving these things up to interpretation. But I feel a little bit more openness to the demonic in them. But that could just be their way of exploring some kind of existential theme. I'm not sure really how to interpret that, or if you've noticed the same thing.
Yeah, it is interesting. I do think, as you said, that there was a time in which like the word pagan meant, it just had an utterly negative connotation, I think, in most media.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily sure that in like those films by Eggers or Astor that it's necessarily treated with like a positive lens either, but it's definitely not so clear cut, I think.
Maybe it's just that we're in a time where we can push, we can push the body horror and the physicality of things now to such a degree that we just want to go darker, darker, darker. And maybe because maybe they're just now we get so dark that it's harder to see the light, or we're like filmmakers are just asking us to look even darker, go even deeper into the abyss. And maybe there's a glimmer of hope at the end, but it's harder to see.
Yeah. I think, well, with regard to the paganism thing, you know, that's such an interesting question because, well, it's an interesting question because for me, horror is always about, or not always about, but oftentimes horror is this idea of like confronting the other. You know, we are, the suspense is created by like something that is considered unknown to the central characters of the movie and thereby the audience, right? And so paganism, especially in Christian society, it's always, you know, of course it's like, you know, non-Christians were historically considered, you know, the other in some way, right? And and now it's like I don't even really have an answer to this, but now with like so much religious diversity in the country, and you have people that like take up the mantle of like, I am pagan and I practice some form of like Wicca or something like that. It does make me wonder, maybe like if I were them, and I'm not, but you know, and so maybe I'm and so maybe I'm speaking out of turn. Maybe they wouldn't, you know, necessarily like this, but I wonder, like, I wouldn't necessarily watch Hereditary or Midsummer and think that it's treating me with like a positive attitude.
Fair enough.
You know what I mean?
Enough.
And so I do wonder, like, how it's interesting to me because you have people that take on those religious identities now. Like, what is their perspective on like the witch or like horror that still very much rests in ideas of like witchcraft and paganism, when now you have people that claim that like that's their religious identity, you know?
I don't know. How do you think like a Catholic can engage in horror, because it's taking us to the brink, and it's taking us to a sort of the brink of death, so to speak. I don't know if you have a prescription for all Catholics, but how do you kind of interpret it with yourself?
Yeah. I mean, kind of like we said earlier, I do think Catholicism as a faith is unique to some degree in that we are constantly called to confront ideas of death and like dying in the flesh to rise in the spirit, and you know, as Paul would say, and so I think that we already sort of talk about and participate in a close relationship with death, and so in terms of how that affects our relationship to like horror films, I guess. Well, I think it's varied. One thing I'll say is that I think is interesting about Catholicism and horror is that, you know, earlier we were talking about if it makes the final cut. I mentioned how like horror tends to be about this confrontation with the other, which is why paganism tends to, you know, kind of come up. But it's also interesting, especially in the United States, how for a lot of American history, you know, Catholics have been treated at best with suspicion. You know?
Right.
And so I think it's interesting to see how much like Catholicism is used as or Catholic elements are used in horror by, I think, largely non-Catholic film creators. Now, I could be wrong there, but I know like The Exorcist, The Omen, you know, films like this that are very much leaning into this idea that Catholicism's a little weird, or there's something, you know, a little scary about it.
What was that? There's that series, The Nun. That's
oh
that
keeps coming The Nun. Yeah.
The funny thing about Exorcist and The Omen. Now I haven't seen the original Omen, but I have seen the original Exorcist, and that is directed by someone who has faith and feared the devil.
Okay.
And you can tell. Now, there's some things that I wish that I had never seen in that film, I have to say.
Yeah.
But I feel like that film is scarier to a Catholic because it takes the devil so seriously. And I don't know, that one again, I almost wish I hadn't seen it.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel offended by it necessarily. I felt like it was coming from a place of legitimate dread. What are some other films that you you don't even have to recommend them because some of these could be tough and no one has to watch these. But what are some of your favorite horror movies as well?
Well, going off of the idea of like composition for suspense building, one movie that I really liked the first time I watched it was Paranormal Activity.
Yeah.
I don't think I like any of the other movies in that series, but the first one was really great because it was done on such a low budget. I mean, it was a very low budget film, and they scare you through such simple means. There's one scene in which I guess the characters, it's been a while, but the characters are trying to like, they have a camera set up in their room at night because they know something's maybe happening. They're not sure what. And there's this shot where they're just sleeping in their bed and they have their like recording camera set up, and it's just, you see the bedroom through it and the door's open, and it just kind of lingers on this for a little bit. Nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden the door just kind of like moves a little bit. And that's all that happens. And you know, all they did was like tie a string to the other side of the door and pull it. I mean, it had to have been the cheapest thing possible, but just that little effect was the simplest thing, but it made you scared. And I thought that movie did a really good job of that. Now, maybe the third act of the film maybe wasn't as great. I don't know if it hit the landing per se, but for most of that movie, I thought it did a great job of suspense building through very simple means.
That's kind of my central fascination with horror is how do you, through composition and editing and the laying out of certain events in a certain order, create terror within an audience and a feeling of dread. Can you think of a movie that really made you feel scared, like in the room while you were watching it?
Yeah. Yes. So one, I agree with you. I do think that best horror films are the ones that through composition and editing and story structure create suspense that makes you afraid. I think I hate horror films that are just like blood fests the entire time, where there's no suspense. It's all just about making your stomach churn because of what you're seeing.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of that. I don't think that I would argue that perhaps that's not even horror per se, or it doesn't generate the same. I think those are two different emotional experiences.
Yeah.
Being grossed out versus.
Yeah. It's the yuck thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I think Stephen King made that delineation. Like when he's exhausted all of his tools, he just goes for the gross out. That was his way of explaining it.
Right. But actually, I would argue my favorite film of all time does this excellently, which is Halloween, John Carpenter's Halloween.
I just saw that last year for the first time.
Yeah.
Alone at my house on a Halloween night, and it was it was stormy out. It was maybe the best or the worst time to watch it.
Yeah. But it's a film where there's actually very little overt violence. There's hardly any blood in it at all. The film, through composition, through pacing, through the music especially, it just builds up this suspense throughout the film because you keep seeing this figure just kind of pop in and out of the story. And so I think that's a film that does it very well.
Yes.
Because it just does not rely on the sort of yuck factor of anything.
Yeah. Like horror films are fun, and it makes me... I was interested that you're relating horror so much to tragedy, because a lot of people relate horror, or maybe the effects of it, to comedy. It's almost like the rules of setting up comedy and the surprise of comedy goes hand in hand with the way that you set up a scare. Yeah. And a comedic horror film that it is full of gore and everything, but it is in a complete comic light, is Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn.
Right. Which
is one of the best made movies I've ever seen, honestly, like from the director of the original Spider-Man trilogy. And you can see the through line there, the way that these gags really are constructed to torture its poor protagonist, who is giving an amazing comic performance. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, I would definitely.
It's great.
That's a great Halloween watch.
Yeah.
For any college viewers watching.
Did you ever see one of Peter Jackson's earliest films? Is it Dead Alive?
Yeah. Oh man. Okay, and then taking that same concept and doubling the the gore.
Yeah.
Talk about a movie that was rated NC-17 only for gore and violence. The rest, it's a PG film, basically. I would think there's no swearing or anything like that in it, and it's basically a romance. But but at the center, but it is surrounded by it's absurd. It is an absurd zombie film with no zombie rules either. That's a great one to watch if you are looking for a good time.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you want to gross out your girlfriend or something.
And the blood doesn't look real at all.
No.
It's looked like this weird orange tone to it. It's
very silly. No, yeah. Peter Jackson, director of Lord of the Rings, started in horror films, folks, and I think you can see that through line there as well in his Lord of the Rings films.
Yeah.
With the depiction of the orcs and he has some fun with violence in those movies as well.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Bowman, thanks so much for coming on this program and talking about horror films. I hope we can do it again. Now, you just put on The Glass Menagerie at Benedictine College, which is another a horror film of a different kind, I guess,
sure.
Psychological. But I know that you also do some work in Kansas City. What could you describe what that work's about?
Yeah, I'm the producing artistic director of Kansas City Public Theater. I run that with my wife, Elizabeth, who's also a faculty member here at Benedictine College. So it's a nonprofit professional theater company. Our mission is arts accessibility. We call our mission radical hospitality. So we try to produce professional theater in such a way that it's accessible for people. So we don't charge admission to any of our events. And it's often produced in sort of storefront environments, kind of easily accessible locations for a lot of people. And we always have stuff going on down there. Actually, last year, we always do some sort of Halloween themed.
Oh yeah?
Often, like we did talk about horror. We recently did a production of the play Dr. Faustus.
Oh, yes.
Which was by Christopher Marlowe, which I adapted, and we did it in. There's a neighborhood called the West Bottoms in Kansas City. For those of you who don't know, it's where all the haunted houses are. We partnered with a winery that was sort of right in the middle of all the haunted houses, and we did Dr. Faustus. We sort of converted the tasting room into a little theater performance space.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah, it was fun.
Well, I hope that this program in Kansas City really helps people just enjoy theater from backstage, but also just as an audience member. And thanks for everything you've been doing for Benedictine, bringing your talents to Benedictine, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
All right, Patrick. Well, that was my conversation with Dr. Nathan Bowman, and I thought it went pretty well.
You called Robert Eggers David Eggers.
Yeah, I did. I know.
And you called his dissertation
a
thesis.
I know. These mistakes will haunt me forever.
Yes, we will.
What do you mean, we? That was the Catholic Film Club. I'm Michael Coy, and that was Patrick Bautista. This is brought to you by the Center for Catholic Media at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. You can follow us on our social, and please be sure to participate in our film club. Send in your comments about Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. I feel so cold.
I want to keep it rolling because BTS will